All right, in 15 minutes, I'm going to try to make 3 points, basically relating what I think are obviously the 3 key areas that gravitate around the topic of this forum. One is neurotechnology, and that's a big word. Obviously, involves not just neurotechnology as the one I'm going to be talking about, but also gene editing and other things that they are part of the forum. Okay. Then there is AI, which is also another big word that everybody uses this day, and here in my talk will involve specifically machine learning or some type of algorithms that are part of what we call the brain-machine interface loop. Okay. And then neuroscience, and specifically I will be talking about neuroplasticity and how we can get insights from these 3 areas as we do this work. And it will be like a short survey of the last 20 years and how these things are actually impacting now, where we're heading towards, based on very basic fundamental principles that I think are very interesting and very relevant to the augmentation or enhancement part. What you see in the loop in the bottom middle part of this slide is what we refer to as the BMI loop, and it's tried to represent there are many different modalities that you can use, from fully non-invasive, as we will see represented in this forum many times, to pseudo-invasive or fully invasive, which are the ones I will be talking about, which represent recordings from individual neurons in different cortical or subcortical areas in the brain. Okay, and then regardless of what type of signals you're using, they all feed eventually into that blue box there, which is the decoder or the AI part of this loop, right? Which is basically the translation of these neural signals into some type of command to, as Antonio was talking about Gregoire's work, for example, to repair movement in people, in quadriplegics, or to steer a wheelchair, or more relevant perhaps to the enhancement part of this forum, to learn new skills, basically abstract skills, different types of skills that we might not even be aware of them yet, using the analogy of before the operating systems, the graphical user interfaces came, the DOS days where you will execute one program at a time, and you could not imagine having a desktop with 20 different things open simultaneously and doing things. That's how I like to think about these things when people ask me, what are abstract skills? What type of skills or tasks are you talking about that they are not the ones that we think in daily tasks? Well, we could discuss some of them in this forum, but others will keep coming through the years as these technologies are available, and we, for example, can enhance our degree of freedom for control on the motor control side, right? Being able to interact with environments that are multidimensional, and we can do things that today is hard to visualize. Okay. The dream, as I put it up there, is not just the clinical side of things, which is perhaps the most important today, and the one that really is happening now, both in neurological disorders, but also in mental health. And I will talk a little bit about that, but obviously the beyond part, right, which represents enhancement, which is more the topic of this forum. So I'm going to skip through some of these slides. I want to make 3 points on the neurotech side of things, and specifically on the motor control side. The point I want to make is that technology is still rudimentary. I'm using old examples of like 10-year-old examples of stroke patients implanted to control different robotic arms to execute tasks like drinking or eating. But the point is that even though these are old examples, the technologies today don't allow us to do much better than this. You still see improvements today in how part of the studies from these groups and others have done, but still, could we get the volume down? Thanks. But still, so the bottle is half full, but there's a long way to go yet, right, to really execute motor control in a natural way. Okay, both on the execution side, or actuators, but also on the type of technologies that are in the US approved by the FDA to be put in humans. Okay? There are others not represented here, but still these technologies are, on the case of intracortical recordings, pretty rudimentary, and they don't last very long. There are new developments that will be represented in this forum from other companies, which are very exciting. But again, that's really happening now under the radar. These are things that are FDA approved and published. Okay, so that's point one. On the neuroscience side of things, I want to make, as I mentioned, one point on neuroplasticity and on the capacity of the brain to learn to control arbitrarily chosen neurons to learn some type of new skill or new task in order to get some reward. This is what FFETs in the late 60s and early 70s pioneered, this concept of the volitional control of neural activity through biofeedback. And it's very interesting because basically he was selecting arbitrary neurons in a monkey brain and getting those monkeys to learn to control those neurons in order to get a use reward. So the big question of how does the brain find those neurons that are arbitrarily selected, and what's the mechanism that allows the brain really to learn a new task, a new skill, whether it's to move something or to select something, how does that work? This concept is really the pillar of the BMI, brain-machine interface field that we all basically fed from to execute, basically to try to learn about how this happens and to improve, or using this to really get on the type of examples I used on those videos and beyond. This is just the techniques that we have been using in my lab at Berkeley. We simplify this in a task like what you see there, which is a monkey controlling a cursor in 2 dimensions to basically execute a center-out task. And the very important part here is that the animal is not moving its limbs. It's not doing this as Antonio was referring to natural motor control tasks in the case of walking from Gregoire Courtine's work. The important thing here is that this is an abstract task. Even though it looks like something is moving, it's not happening by the animal moving the arm or thinking about moving the arm. Okay? It's learning basically to control that thing, to hit a target and get reward. Okay? And in the most abstract case, and I will show you proof of that in a moment. And you can do this with recordings, electrophysiological recordings, or even with calcium imaging. If you want to understand more of the fundamental properties of how these neurons connect and rewire through this learning process. So one of the fundamental results that we found in the past decade was that the primate brain, while learning to execute this task that you just saw, forms what we call a natural motor memory, sorry, not a natural, sorry, a motor memory. So a memory that is for that prosthetic device or task that has been learned. So you choose arbitrary neurons on day 1, let's say 20 neurons, and you follow what these neurons do across 20 days and how the animal learns to perform and master that task. And what you observe in late learning is that this map that forms is stable and it's across time, like a motor memory. Like in the same way you learn to perform a task, driving a car or playing the piano or something, and then once you know how to do it, you plug and play. You sit and perform the task, right? So these animals were ready from the first trial to execute perfectly after having learned the task, and that memory was retained in those cells, right? It's interesting because you chose those cells, and that task was unknown for that animal 20 days before starting, right? So how does that happen? Well, what we saw is that there is a spatial refinement in local cortical networks, meaning that the brain learns to solve what in AI or neural networks is known as the credit assignment problem, right? How to change the weights of certain neurons in order to perform better, or that network to do better or learn, right? So we observed that that process happened as the animal was learning. Still, we don't know which areas or how does the brain really, as an organ, does that. But in the locality of these cells, we observed that phenomenon. With respect to the where does this learning takes place in the brain, other than these output neurons or cells that we selected, we observed also that there is this very well understood loops, corticostriatal loops in the mammalian brain that are necessary for action, to learn action behavior. And it turns out that this same machinery or engine for action is necessary to learn these arbitrary skills. Again, the arbitrary word for me is the relevant one to the enhancement, or relevant to this forum, right? Meaning learning tasks that are not necessarily regain how to move your limbs or your legs, but to control some other more abstract devices to do other things, right? The brain has that capacity to learn to control those things, not just your own body. And so there's plasticity in corticostriatal plasticity, basically showing that without that plasticity, the animal cannot learn. And that happens basically through 2 things: feedback, this closed loopness of the animal observing how he's doing the task, and reinforcement, which I'll show in a moment is happening through dopaminergic inputs from VTA into the striatal synapses. The last point about this generability of learning on these cortico-basal ganglia loops, which is pretty striking, is that you could even go to the extreme case and select neurons in the primary visual cortex of mice and rats, and get these animals to learn to use those a priori visual neurons to become action neurons and learn to control this task, as the other animals were doing with motor neurons. Okay, going back again to Fett's principle of these arbitrary neurons, doesn't matter where you choose them, the brain has this capacity, or at least the mammalian cortex, to learn new behaviors. We observed that this happened also even in that case, and requires the same plasticity in the striatum that I described in the motor area. So there's this concept of that is generalizable across cortex, which is very interesting. This is capturing a computational model showing how anatomically that can happen, meaning you could simulate whether if you choose arbitrary neurons in the cortex, how through X number of trials, the animal can actually learn to find those neurons and to strengthen those neurons and the plasticity I just described. Just following the concept that I mentioned and also the anatomy and this dimensionality reduction that happens from the striatum to GPI and then going back as a reentrance to the cortex. Okay, so that's the second point I was trying to make, which is how much real, deep, basic neuroscience research using these paradigms that are more designed or thought for this type of neuroprosthetics and technologies can actually really play together very well and give insight that can be used for the evolution, basically, of this technology. The third one is about representing the AI part, is this concept of a closed-loop decoder adaptation. The idea that the AI module, okay, is in the loop. So there's two learner systems in the loop, the brain, which is what we have been talking until now, and now this decoder algorithm that until now it was just a passive element, basically like a mathematical transform and nothing else than that. But of course, nothing stops you of now using all the power of this artificial adaptation in tandem with this natural adaptation to accelerate learning and boost performance and maintain this performance, right? So what you see represented here is a cartoon showing that you could train these algorithms in an unsupervised way, supervised way, or even with signals, error signals from the brain, endogenous signals of error signals coming from the brain that will tell the decoder when to adapt or not. And the three very important parameters are the when, the time scale of adaptation, and this is important because if the decoder adapts too fast, the brain might lose that and becomes a moving target. So you have to do this carefully because they're very different, the scales of adaptation, the natural and the artificial one, which parameters of the decoder to adapt and how, which learning rule, for example. So this is a whole field of research that is very interesting. And here you can put, obviously, your favorite deep learning network or anything, right? You can imagine how much you could enhance what would be otherwise a motor prosthetic if you just put in tandem a full brain with a very powerful AI module fed with behavioral data and neural data and many things. And the very important part here is the actual loop, the closed loopness. That's what is key. If you open the loop, it becomes two totally different agents doing different things. One almost last point, we have been thinking also how to bring these principles into a less invasive approach that could be adopted by society more, but basically following the same neuroplasticity principle that you can learn arbitrary skills. And here the question is whether human participants could learn to to volitionally modulate individual motor neurons, just say in your muscle in your arm or in your neck, to control a prosthetic device. And this is interesting, obviously, because you can record those motor units non-invasively with a technique called EMG and this high-definition EMG, and things like that allow this. But what it was not known is whether you could the brain basically dissociate these motor units that were traditionally known to be tied in what is known as the size principle, that you recruit these motor units depending on how much strength, for example, you need in your task. But there is an order of recruitment, one, the second, the third motor unit. But could you arbitrarily modulate these motor units to achieve the task, like X, Y, and Z coordinates? And this is what a postdoc in my lab and a grad student, recently shown that actually human participants could do this. And this is actually being used right now in Meta, Google, and other companies in their divisions doing virtual reality and other things, right? How to really have easily deployable technology that could exploit these principles, as I show, in terms of neuroplasticity and the brain-machine interface aspect of it. And just one very quick point on the mental health part of it. There's very exciting work happening at UCSF in Eddie Chang's lab and many other labs too, but using this concept of the network. The mental health is a network problem, it's not a focal problem. So with the use of new technologies that we allow really to place in the brain in many different spots, different technologies that will allow them to record and stimulate these areas. They have been shown, for example, that you can train the human brain to modulate the mood of patients with the idea of unlearning, which is the opposite of what we're doing now, maladaptive behavior. So induce plasticity, not to learn to perform a task, but to forget that task. Okay, this is a super exciting topic now. It's very recent, still in the very early days, but it uses the same concept of closed-loopness, but now more like Alvaro was talking, into the stimulation into the brain as opposed to the reading out from the brain. And I think I'm going to stop there and just thanking all my former students, postdocs, and collaborators, and all of you. Thank you.